In April 1944, in Berlin, General Lieutenant Adolf Galland stood before the German Air Ministry with a report that nobody wanted to read. Between January and April 1944, the Luftwaffe's daytime fighter force had lost more than 1,000 pilots killed, not captured or wounded. These were men who had been at the top of their game, squadron commanders, group leaders, and commanders with over 50, 60, or even 70 aerial victories. The problem was that these men were irreplaceable as the training programs that had produced them no longer existed. Galland knew many of these men personally. Now, he had the unenviable task of explaining why Germany's fighter force was, in his own words, on the brink of collapse. The answer was simple, but harsh. It was mathematical. And mathematics doesn't bend for generals. Adolf Galland was far from a typical general. At just 32 years old, he held the rank of general lieutenant, making him the youngest general officer in the entire German military. He had amassed 104 confirmed aerial victories, all against Western Allied aircraft. Galland wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, a distinction only 27 men in German history had earned. Since November 1941, he had been the commander of all Luftwaffe fighter forces. His reputation was legendary, marked by his slicked-back black hair, thin mustache, and ever-present cigar, which he often kept between his teeth, even while flying. His aircraft was adorned with a Mickey Mouse emblem, an irreverent detail that somehow made him seem even more intimidating. Galland looked every bit the fighter pilot, the image that had been carefully crafted in propaganda films. But unlike other generals who spent their time in conference rooms studying maps, Galland ignored orders from high command to stay grounded. Despite being forbidden from flying combat missions, he took to the skies for unauthorized sorties. Conducting secret operations, Galland knew he needed to understand what was happening to his pilots, to experience what they were going through. By early 1944, the skies above Germany had become a terrifying place for him. That spring, he climbed into the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190 and took off to intercept an American bomber formation near Magdeburg in central Germany. He soon found himself facing a group of B-17 Flying Fortresses large, 4-engine bombers armed with defensive guns. Galland attacked, but within moments, 4 P-51 Mustangs were on his tail. Galland, experienced as he was, knew that trying to engage in a dogfight with 4 enemy fighters would be a deadly mistake. The P-51s were fast, nimble, and piloted by men specifically trained to hunt down pilots like him. So he did the only thing he could: he dove. The Mustangs followed closely behind. Their tracer shells streaked through the air so near that Galland could see the individual rounds burning as they passed. Here was Germany's most decorated ace, the commander of a vast air force, fleeing for his life from 4 American pilots whose names he would never know. Galland survived by using a trick he had relied on before. While diving, he fired his own machine guns, sending streams of smoke trailing behind his aircraft. The American pilots, seeing what appeared to be rear-firing weapons, broke off their pursuit, trained not to take unnecessary risks. Galland escaped, but as he made his way back to base, his hands still trembling on the controls, he fully realized what had just transpired. The Americans had shown no hesitation. They had not been intimidated by his skill, reputation, or decorations. They had attacked with overwhelming numbers and pressed that advantage without mercy. 4 against 1, and they had nearly won. This was the harsh new reality of the air war over Germany. Galland knew that the situation was deteriorating with every passing week. For him, the crisis that was decimating his fighter force had a clear starting point: the final week of February 1944. The Americans called it Operation Argument, but history would remember it as Big Week. From February 20th to February 25th, over 3,000 American heavy bombers, escorted by more than 1,000 fighters, attacked key German aircraft factories across the Reich. The targets were carefully chosen: Messerschmitt plants, Focke-Wulf assembly lines, ball bearing factories, and engine production facilities, everything the Luftwaffe needed to keep fighting. Day after day, the bombers came, wave after wave. Their formation stretched for miles across the sky. Hundreds of aircraft flew in precise defensive boxes, their contrails leaving white streaks across the German homeland. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to rise and meet them. The factories being destroyed were producing the very aircraft they needed to survive. Every Messerschmitt 109 rolling off the assembly line meant another chance to shoot down a bomber. Every factory burned meant fewer fighters in the months to come. German pilots attacked with everything at their disposal: single-engine fighters diving through the bomber formations, guns blazing, and twin-engine destroyers firing rockets into the packed bombers. The sky over Germany became a deadly battlefield in 6 days of relentless combat. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 350 fighter aircraft, 1/3 of their available fighters wiped out in less than a week. But aircraft could be replaced. Even damaged factories could still produce new fighters. The true catastrophe, however, was something far worse than the loss of machines. In those 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost 17% of its fighter pilots. Galland immediately understood the gravity of the situation. A destroyed Messerschmitt factory could be rebuilt, but the loss of experienced pilots like these was irreplaceable. Aircraft could be replaced in just 3 or 4 weeks. A new plane could roll off the assembly line and be delivered to a frontline unit within a month. But a pilot with 2 years of flight training, hundreds of hours of combat experience, and the hard-earned skills to survive against American fighters could not be replaced. Not in a month, not in a year, and perhaps never. And the losses didn't stop after Big Week. March was worse, and April was even worse. What made the situation even more dire for Galland was the change in American tactics. Before 1944, American escort fighters had stayed close to their bomber formations. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings flew defensive patterns around the B-17 and B-24, only engaging German fighters when they came near the bombers. Their role was defensive, protecting the bombers, not attacking the enemy. But in early 1944, everything changed. General James Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, issued orders that completely transformed the air war. American fighters were no longer limited to close escort duty. They were now free to hunt. They could fly ahead of the bombers, seeking out German fighters before they could organize for attacks. They could follow retreating German aircraft back to their airfields, strafe planes on the ground, destroy aircraft during takeoff, and kill pilots before they even reached altitude. The P-51 Mustang made all of this possible. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and added fuel capacity from drop tanks, the Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back. It could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home, and it could engage German aircraft on equal or even superior terms. For Galland, the consequences were disastrous. Wherever our fighters appeared, he later reflected, as Galland later wrote, the Americans threw themselves at the Luftwaffe with relentless force. They began to conduct low-level attacks on German airfields. No place was safe anymore. The German pilots had to hide even on their own bases during takeoff, during assembly, while climbing, approaching the bombers, in combat, during the return journey, and even after landing. American fighters attacked with overwhelming superiority at every stage. The ratio of forces had become unmanageable. American fighters outnumbered German defenders by 6-1, and in some cases 8-1, and the quality of American pilot training Galland noted with professional admiration was astonishing. These were no amateurs. They were seasoned professionals. They had more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, and more pilots than Galland could ever hope to match. For Galland, understanding the full extent of the American advantage meant looking beyond just the numbers of aircraft or tactics. The problem ran much deeper. It started with training. In 1944, the United States trained 29,000 new military pilots. Each of these pilots received around 200 hours of flight time before being assigned to a combat unit. They practiced instrument flying, formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and combat maneuvering. They used Link Trainer's mechanical flight simulators that allowed them to practice without risking aircraft or lives. They had unlimited fuel for training flights, as well as unlimited aircraft and time. When an American pilot arrived at his unit in England or Italy, he was ready, not experienced, but competent. He knew how to fly his aircraft, how to fight, and had the skills to survive long enough to gain experience. Germany, on the other hand, had none of these advantages. By 1944, Luftwaffe flight training had been severely cut back. Fuel shortages meant fewer hours of training. Aircraft shortages meant fewer training flights. A shortage of instructors meant less personalized training. The pilots arriving at Galland's frontline units in early 1944 had often received less than 80 hours of total flight time. Some had never even fired their guns at a moving target, nor practiced combat maneuvers against an experienced opponent. Galland watched these replacement pilots, young men, 18, 19, or 20 years old, full of enthusiasm and convinced they would become aces. Just like the heroes they'd heard about on German radio. They believed that courage and determination alone would be enough. Most of them were dead within 30 days. The math was cruel. An experienced pilot who survived his first 10 combat missions had a decent chance of making it through the war. His skills would improve with each flight. He would learn the tricks that kept him alive and develop the instincts that separated the quick from the dead. But a pilot who arrived at his unit with inadequate training rarely had the time to gain experience. He made mistakes that veterans would avoid. He flew into situations that seasoned pilots would have steered clear of. He died before he could become good. Galland referred to these young men as cannon fodder. It wasn't an insult, but a harsh statement of mathematical reality. While Galland struggled to keep his pilots alive, America's industrial machine was operating at a scale that seemed almost unfathomable. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run factory in Michigan, B-24 Liberator bombers rolled off the production line at a rate of 1 per hour. A complete 4-engine heavy bomber with turrets, bomb bays, instruments, and defensive armor was finished and ready for delivery every 60 minutes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When a B-24 was shot down over Germany, another one was already being built to replace it. When a crew of 10 men was killed or captured, a new crew was completing their training at airbases scattered across the American South and West. The American industrial system never stopped. It never slowed down. It simply kept producing. Galland's American counterparts didn't face the same challenges he did. They didn't have to worry about whether launching an attack today would leave them vulnerable tomorrow. They didn't have to decide which targets to defend because they didn't have enough aircraft to cover them all. They didn't have to watch irreplaceable veteran pilots die, knowing that the replacements wouldn't be sufficient. The Americans could absorb losses that would have wiped out the Luftwaffe twice over. They could lose 100 bombers in a single raid and launch another raid the next day with even more aircraft. They could trade casualties at rates that seemed suicidal and still come out ahead. Each enemy raid. Galland reported to the Air Ministry in the spring of 1944. Was costing them around 50 aircrew members, 50 pilots per raid. Some raids came up to 3 times per week. resulting in 150 pilots lost every week and 600 pilots every month. The math was catastrophic. German factories were still producing fighters, and in fact, thanks to dispersal programs and underground production facilities, German fighter output was even increasing in 1944, but production meant little without pilots to fly the aircraft. Fuel was growing increasingly scarce as Allied bombers targeted refineries and synthetic oil plants. Spare parts were becoming harder to find. The entire infrastructure supporting the Luftwaffe was collapsing from all directions. Galland could see the end coming. He could calculate precisely when his fighter force would no longer be an effective fighting unit. In April 1944, Adolf Galland delivered his assessment to the German High Command. The report was detailed, precise, and devastating. Between January and April, the Luftwaffe had suffered irreparable losses. Luftwaffe's daytime fighter force had lost over 1,000 pilots killed in action. Among the dead were the most experienced squadron commanders, group leaders, and wing commanders and the servicemen with decades of combined experience, who had written the very tactics used by German pilots. These were men whose expertise died with them. The quality of the replacement pilots was dangerously inadequate. The ratio of forces continued to worsen, and the enemy showed no signs of reducing the intensity of their attacks. The trajectory of the air war seemed to point to only one inevitable outcome. "The time has come," Galland wrote, "when our weapon is in sight of collapse." He proposed solutions desperate, but solutions nonetheless. Galland wanted to assemble a massive reserve force of fighters, possibly 2,000 or more, and hold them back from daily combat. When the right conditions arose, this force would be unleashed in a single, massive attack against an American bomber formation. If they could destroy 400 or 500 bombers in one day, perhaps the Americans would be forced to pause their offensive. Maybe that would provide enough time to rebuild. Galland called this plan the Big Blow. He believed it was Germany's last chance to regain some control over the skies. His superiors listened to his proposal. They examined his numbers. They discussed the plan in meetings that stretched for hours. But in the end, they did nothing. The fighters Galland needed were never assembled. The fuel reserves he requested were never allocated. The training programs he demanded were never put into action. The High Command had other priorities: offensives that required air support and the need to defend against threats on multiple fronts. They could not afford to spare 2,000 fighters for a single gamble, no matter how promising it might seem. Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, and the rest of the High Command simply couldn't commit to Galland's plan. The Luftwaffe responded to Galland's reports with accusations rather than solutions. They blamed the fighter pilots for cowardice, accusing them of abandoning their duty. They demanded impossible results with insufficient resources and then expressed outrage when those results didn't materialize. Galland, however, continued to fight. He kept flying his unauthorized missions and watched as his men continued to die in increasing numbers each month. He knew the war was lost, not because German pilots lacked courage, not because German engineers lacked brilliance, and not because German factories lacked productivity. The war was lost because courage, brilliance, and productivity could not defeat a system that produced bombers faster. Then they could be shot down and train pilots faster. Then they could be killed. The air war over Europe was no longer being decided by individual aces performing heroic feats. It was being determined by factories in Michigan and training bases in Texas. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe could barely contest the skies over France. German pilots who rose to attack the invasion forces were immediately intercepted by swarms of American and British fighters. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, Spitfires, and typhoons patrolled the skies in such overwhelming numbers that any German aircraft spotted was almost immediately engaged by multiple enemies. The few German pilots who managed to reach the beaches found themselves attacking under fire, unable to aim properly or make multiple passes, accomplishing little before being driven off or shot down. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew approximately 300 sorties, while the Allies flew over 14,000. Air superiority belonged to the Allies, and it would never return to German hands. Adolf Galland survived the war, but in January 1945, he was finally removed from his position as General der Jagdflieger. After years of conflict with Göring and the High Command, Galland was finally sidelined. However, instead of being completely removed, he was given command of Jagdverband 44, an elite unit equipped with the new Me-262 jet fighters. Galland continued flying combat missions until April 26, 1945, when his jet was damaged by American P-47 Thunderbolts and he was wounded during a forced landing. He was captured by American forces shortly afterward and spent nearly 2 years in custody. Being interrogated about German aviation technology and tactics, after his release, Galland wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoirs, titled The First and the Last, became one of the most important primary sources for understanding the air war from the German perspective. His conclusion never changed, regardless of how many times he was asked to reconsider it. The war in the air was not won by courage or individual skill alone. It was won by the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. It was won by the ability to train pilots in greater numbers and to higher standards. It was won by systems, not heroes. Individual excellence could not defeat systematic superiority. It never could. The mathematics simply wouldn't allow it. Thank you for watching. If you found this story valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We focus on bringing you the forgotten stories and nuanced truths of World War II that deserve to be remembered. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? What other stories about the air war over Europe would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us continue this mission.